For today, we're going to discuss the anti-human globulin test, also known as the Coombs test. It's one of the most foundational and versatile tests in blood banking. You will encounter it in virtually every major serologic procedure. By the end of this section, you should be able to describe the types of anti-human globulin test reagents, identify the methods of the anti-human globulin test, discuss the principle of the direct AHG test or the DAT, and indirect AHG test or IAT. Enumerate the conditions where globulin tests can be applied, recognize errors encountered in performing AHG tests and their resolutions, enumerate and prepare the needed materials for AHG tests, and interpret the AHG test properly and report results accurately. Image illustrates how two types of antibodies, IgM and IgG, interact differently with red blood cells, particularly in the context of agglutination or clumping of cells. Red blood cells have a net negative charge on their surface, so this creates a natural repulsion between cells, preventing them from sticking together under normal conditions. Surrounding each RBC is a positively charged ionic cloud, which contributes to a separation distance known as the zeta potential. So this keeps RBCs spaced apart. This image highlights how antibody size and structure directly influence function. Even though both IgM and IgG can bind to antigens, only IgM can physically overcome the electrostatic barrier between red blood cells to cause visible clumping on its own. This image further explains the concept of RBC agglutination, focusing on the role of electrostatic forces and antibody size in determining whether agglutination occurs. Agglutination depends not just on antibody binding, but on whether the antibody is physically large enough to overcome electrostatic repulsion between cells. So IgG binds but cannot bridge, therefore no agglutination. IgM binds and bridges, therefore we can see visible agglutination. Putting it all together, let's summarize the key concepts that we have discussed from the previous slides. IgM, its large pentameric structure causes direct agglutination, no additional reagents needed. For IgG, it is smaller than your IgM, monomeric, and binds to RBCs but does not agglutinate. So it requires detection by another method. For anti-IgG or the Coombs reagent, it binds to IgG on RBCs, which enables visible agglutination. So anti-IgG is used in tests like the Coombs test. This concept is crucial in blood typing and cross-matching, as well as hemolytic disease of the newborn, autoimmune hemolytic anemia, because many clinically significant antibodies are IgG. So we rely on anti-IgG reagents in order to detect them. So in essence, what this diagram is teaching us is that not all antibody binding results in visible clumping, but with the right tools like anti-IgG, we can reveal those hidden interactions. Right? Let me start off with a definition of AHG. The anti-human globulin test or the Coombs test is designed to detect IgG antibodies and complement proteins that are attached to red blood cells. The key logic is this. Antibodies and complement proteins, when bound to red cells, are normally too small and too similar to red cells to cause direct agglutination. The AHG reagent acts as a bridge. It is an antibody against human antibodies. And by binding to the cell-bound IgG or complement, it causes the cells to agglutinate and reveal the coating that was otherwise invisible. So for the AHG reagents, so we have polyclonal and monoclonal AHG. AHG reagents may be polyclonal, which is derived from multiple B cell clones recognizing different epitopes, or monoclonal, which is secreted by a single B cell clone with a unique and specific reactivity. Monoclonal reagents are more standardized and reproducible. So let's further differentiate the polyspecific versus monospecific AHG reagents. Dive into the diagram in front of you, let me ask you a question. How does the body know how to fight an infection it has never encountered before? So the answer, of course, lies in the remarkable sophistication of the adaptive immune system, specifically in its ability to recognize foreign molecules, mount a response, and remember that threat for future encounters. So today we are going to exploit this very property in a controlled laboratory setting using a rabbit as our model organism. Why use a rabbit? So rabbits, particularly the New Zealand white rabbit, are the most commonly used species for polyclonal antibody production for several reasons. Rabbits have a robust and well-characterized immune system. They are of convenient size, allowing sufficient blood volume to be drawn repeatedly. They mount strong immune responses to a wide range of antigens, including those that are poorly immunogenic in mice. Furthermore, the rabbit immune repertoire is very diverse, making them excellent producers of high-titer, high-affinity antibodies. So let's take a look at the different steps. So the process begins with immunization. So we take our antigen of interest, perhaps a purified protein from a pathogen, a recombinant molecule, or even a hapten carrier conjugate, and we inject it into our rabbit. So this is called the primary immunization. So once the antigen enters the rabbit's body, the immune system begins to respond. The injected antigen travels through the lymphatic system and is taken up by antigen-presenting cells, particularly our dendritic cells and macrophages, so which process it and present antigen-derived peptide fragments on MHC class II molecules. So this triggers helper T cells, which in turn activate B cells. So after clonal expansion, activated B cells undergo differentiation into two distinct populations. Some activated B cells differentiate into long-lived memory B cells. In the diagram, these are depicted as the larger rounded cells with antibody-like receptors still present on their surface, and memory B cells do not actively secrete antibodies. So the other population of differentiated B cells becomes plasma B cells, also called antibody-secreting cells. In the diagram, you can see these are depicted as elongated, oval-shaped cells with a rough, granular internal structure. So this morphology reflects the reality. Plasma B cells are essentially antibody-producing factories. So after the rabbit has been immunized and has mounted a robust antibody response, typically confirmed by checking antibody titers in a small test bleed, we proceed to collect the anti-serum. Blood is drawn from the rabbit, typically from the ear vein or by cardiac puncture, and allowed to clot. So in the diagram, you can see the test tube next to the rabbit contains a yellowish fluid. This is the serum. So the serum is blood plasma from which the clotting factors have been removed. So the serum contains all the antibodies that were secreted by the plasma B cells into the bloodstream. Because these antibodies came from many different plasma B cell clones, all targeting different epitopes of the injected antigen, this serum is called anti-serum, or specifically polyclonal anti-serum. Our previous slide, we explored how polyclonal antibodies are produced, so a process that taps into the natural immune system or immune response of an animal, typically a rabbit, to generate a diverse mixture of antibodies against a given antigen. So now we take that knowledge one step further and ask, what if we could produce a single perfectly uniform antibody, one that recognizes only one specific epitope on unlimited quantities forever? So that was exactly the question that two scientists, George Kohler and Cesar Milstein, which was answered in 1975 when they developed hybridoma technology at the MRC Laboratory of Molecular Biology in Cambridge, England. Their work earned them the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1984, and it fundamentally transformed medicine, diagnostics, and biological research. So, the monoclonal antibodies produced by their method are now among the most important therapeutic molecules in modern medicine. From cancer immunotherapy to autoimmune disease treatment. So the process begins with immunization. So notice in the diagram, a mouse, not a rabbit this time. Mice, particularly the BALB dash slash C inbred strain, are the most commonly used species for hybridoma technology. This is partly because the myeloma cell lines most compatible for fusion were originally derived from mice, ensuring species compatibility during cell fusion. In the center of the diagram, you can see plasma cells depicted as rounded blue-purple cells. These are the antibody-secreting effector cells that have differentiated from activated B cells following antigen stimulation. As we covered in the last slide, plasma cells are essentially antibody factories. So their cytoplasm is densely packed with rough endoplasmic reticulum and they can secrete thousands of antibody molecules per second. Notice the green cells in the upper right corner of the diagram. These are the tumor cells, specifically myeloma cells. A myeloma is a malignant cancer of the plasma cells. So the myeloma cell lines used in hybridoma technology have two critical properties that make them ideal fusion partners. So this is the heart of hybridoma technology. So the splenic cells from the immunized mouse are mixed with the myeloma cells and exposed to a cell fusion agent. So the most commonly used fusion agent is the polyethylene glycol, which is a polymer that disrupts cell membranes and causes them to merge. Alternatively, electrofusion using electrical pulses can also be employed. Cell fusion is a relatively random and inefficient process. So the outcome of mixing produces several types of cells. So we have unfused myeloma cells. We also have unfused B cells, myeloma fusions, the B cell fusions, and most importantly, B cell myeloma hybrids, which are the hybridoma cells we want. So in the diagram, these are the blue cells labeled hybridoma cells shown as a growing cluster. Image illustrates how the immune system recognizes and responds to foreign substances using antibodies, focusing on the difference between polyclonal antiserum and monoclonal antibodies. So at the core of this concept are antigens, which are foreign molecules, often proteins from pathogens that trigger an immune response. Each antigen contains multiple distinct regions called epitopes, which are the specific sites that antibodies recognize and bind to. Antibodies themselves are Y-shaped proteins produced by B cells, and each antibody is highly specific to a particular epitope. So on the left side of the image, polyclonal antiserum is shown. So this represents a natural immune response where multiple B cell clones produce a variety of antibodies. Each of these antibodies targets a different epitope on the same antigen. So as a result, polyclonal antibodies form a diverse mixture that can bind to several sites on an antigen simultaneously. This diversity increases the likelihood of successful binding, even if some epitopes are hidden or altered, making polyclonal antibodies generally more robust but less specific. On the right side, monoclonal antibodies are depicted. These are produced from a single clone of B cells, meaning all antibodies are identical and bind to only one specific epitope of the antigen. So this uniformity provides high specificity and consistency, which is especially valuable in controlled applications like laboratory assays, diagnostics, and targeted therapies. However, because they recognize only one epitope, monoclonal antibodies can be less effective if that specific binding site is changed or unavailable. Differentiate polyspecific versus monospecific AHG. Polyspecific AHG contains antibodies to both human IgG and to C3d, a component of complement, and sometimes anti-C3b and anti-C4b. So it detects both antibody coating and complement activation. For monospecific AHG, on the other hand, contains only one antibody specificity, either anti-IgG alone or anti-C3d alone. Using monospecific reagents allows the laboratory to determine what is coating the red cell. Is it IgG? Is it complement? Or both? Talk about the principle of DAT. So it detects in vivo sensitization, meaning coating that happened inside the body. It identifies IgG antibodies, complement molecules, or both that are already bound to the patient's red blood cells before any laboratory manipulation. So a positive DAT is a significant clinical finding. It is associated with HDFN, HTR, IHA, and sometimes drug-induced hemolytic anemia. In the DAT, the process is straightforward. The patient's red blood cells are washed with saline at least 3 to 4 times to remove unbound proteins from the plasma. Then, AHG reagent is added directly. If agglutination occurs, the test is positive, meaning antibodies or complement were already coating those cells in the patient's body. So, just think it this way. Compare DAT to finding evidence at a crime scene that already happened, so the antibodies are already there attached to the cells. Of IAT, or indirect antiglobulin test, detects in vitro sensitization, meaning we are creating the coating in the laboratory under controlled conditions. So the patient's serum is incubated with donor or reagent red blood cells to allow any antibodies in the serum to bind to the antigens on those cells. Then we wash and add AHG to detect the reaction. So the IAT is used for antibody screening, antibody identification, pre-transfusion cross-matching, antigen typing, and as well as week D testing. For the procedure, first we add patient serum to reagent red cells of known antigen type. Then incubate at 37 degrees Celsius for 30 to 60 minutes to allow antibody-antigen binding. Third, wash the cells 3 to 4 times with saline to remove unbound serum proteins. Fourth, we are going to add AHG reagent, then mix and centrifuge. For step 5, we are going to gently resuspend the cell button and read for agglutination and then grade and record. So lastly, for negative results, you can add IgG-coated control cells to confirm AHG reagent validity. So think of IAT this way. So the IAT is like planning a crime. We are deliberately setting up the reaction in the lab to see if it happens. So contrast this with the DAT, where the reaction already happened inside the patient. Lead to the errors in AHG testing. First, we have the false negative results. The most common cause of a false negative in AHG testing is inadequate washing of the red cells. If residual unbound IgG from the plasma remains, it will neutralize the AHG reagent. The AHG reagent binds to free IgG in solution rather than to cell-bound IgG. Always wash at least 3 to 4 times. Other causes of false negatives include insufficient volume of AHG reagent added, delayed reading, so you need to read within 1 minute of adding AHG, as weakly bound AHG can dissociate. Expired or improperly stored AHG, so you can store it at 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. Using too heavy or too light an RBC suspension, so you can always use 2 to 5%. And for the false positive results, false positives can occur due to over-centrifugation, cells packed too tightly and appear as if agglutination occurred, contaminated reagents or dirty glassware. Microbial growth or residual proteins cause non-specific agglutination, cold agglutinins or loop formation. Use saline replacement tests to differentiate lack of proper controls. Always include a negative control. And with that, everyone, I would like to conclude our discussion with regards to anti-human globulin testing. Hopefully, you have learned something from this video. Thank you so much for listening, and once again, have a good day.